record. There we go. So this is where we left off on Friday. No, today's Friday. No, what is today? I am so done with this semester. This semester finished me off a long time ago. Monday. Right. As we were talking about on Thursday, on the front of the Cathedral of San Lazare in Autun, where the bones of Lazarus were held in the Middle Ages, the guy Jesus raised from the dead after he eventually died, he and Mary Magdalene and others traveled to France. This is where they finally died, and their bones are kept here. So this is in Burgundy, the region of Burgundy in France. And thus the church is named in the city of Autun. The church is named San Lazare. And on the tympanum, here, let me just fix that. On the tympanum here, we have a scene of the Last Judgment, which we were talking about on Thursday, which is the scene of Christ appearing at the end of time to separate the good from the evil, the saved from the damned. And in the Romanesque period, this early part of the 12th century, at the end of the investiture conflict, which we talked about last week, at the end of the investiture conflict, the church is pretty much the most powerful entity in Europe. The Holy Roman Empire had its total power somewhat gutted by that conflict. And the church emerges for a brief period very, very powerful. And the images that churches tend to use, the imagery they use both in the architectural style and in the sculptures that appear on these Romanesque churches, relate to this newfound power. And so the idea of using a Roman arch as the basis for the architecture relates to this idea that they are the new Rome in a way, right? That legacy of Rome is so strong. And furthermore, it associates each of these churches in different countries, here in France, associates each of them with the church, which is based in Rome. Right? So the architecture itself has symbolic value in this period, And the sculptures that appear over the doorways of Romanesque churches are most often images of heaven revealed to people on earth. Heaven opening up. Images of the spirit world. Where we see both not only heaven, but also demons from hell. The supernatural realm. Which is something the church knows everything about, and you very much not the same. Right? Less about. And in this case, it's meant to terrify you, because as we saw, the inscription across the base under the saved on your left, Christ's right, says, here are the good, they're getting to heaven. And over the damned on Christ's left, your right, again left and right, symbolic, right? The damned on the opposite side, the inscription under the feet of Christ says, look at the terror of these figures, right? Telling you that this is really a very frightening scene. And even if the figures may look a little silly to us today, they were intended to be frightening. Showing us the demon world. And so when we left off, we saw demons terrorizing the people that are having their souls weighed. So on one side, we have a basket here on the scale that's been broken. Here are the ropes holding the scale, and an angel there steadying it. Right? And here's the little soul that's made it. Right? You weigh the soul. If it's heavy, then the soul is there. It has a soul. It's good. Right? And if the pan goes down, the soul goes up. And there's our little soul. Can't wait to get up to Christ. Right? There's nothing else in the pan here. I think there might be another little soul there, but I don't think so. In the opposite pan, a demon has jumped in there to change the outcome of this judgment. Because if this pan goes down, the soul is found wanting, and that soul would have to go to hell, as opposed to heaven. So they're trying to determine the outcome of the judgment. And here up above, You can see some of the figures that have in fact been damned. And if you look at it here, I know it's blocked by my outline, but there's a demon here with hands, and this is his hand here, and you can see it there as well. And he's taking he's chucking them down into the mouth of hell, like that, one after the other. And that's what these guys here are hoping that they could do to this soul as well, but they can't, because he's really good, and they can't really determine the outcome. Only God can determine the outcome, right? But they can't wait to get their hands on him and scare the crap out of him with their mouths all, teeth, right? Vile, disheveled, misshapen faces, toads and serpents that they're gonna use, on him, in order to terrorize these figures, right? This is the last judgment. This is Christ appearing at the very end of time to separate the saved from the damned. The theme of the saved from the damned being separated and continues on the lintel down below. We saw post and lintels going all the way back to Stonehenge, right? Where we saw a post and lintel system there around the outer ring of Stonehenge. So here we have the same thing. We have these columns down below supporting a lintel underneath the tympanum up above. And on the lintel we see the dead rising from their graves at the end of time. Christ is not only judging those who have already died, right, but as he does this, he hauls them up out of their graves, miraculously, he doesn't grab them, right? But they are hauled from their graves, they step forward, and they await their judgment. So here on Christ's right, which is again the good side, right, we see the figures coming up out of their little graves here, and an angel pointing them toward the light of Christ. And you can see, again, here's that inscription we were talking about, right? And they're at the light of Christ up here. And they're pointing forward. And the figures, as they rise from their grave, they've got that orange pose that we saw going back to the catacombs, right? They're praying, they're good, they can't wait to get there. Here's more of them moving toward the feet of Christ. So you can see the angel is directing them, and they seem to be making this progress this direction. Interestingly here, and we'll talk about this a little bit later tonight, you see this figure has a little shell on his bag, which is the sign of a pilgrim, a medieval pilgrim. And so he's making his sort of final pilgrimage towards God, if you will. Jackie. Good question. That's a really, I don't know. I think I probably, boy, that's a really good question. I don't have an answer. I'm sorry. There's obviously a bishop behind him, right? You see the crozier? The crozier is the stick, right? The staff here. Right? So there's a bishop here. I don't know. I never thought about that before. Because is there a range of scales for humans? Because obviously this person here and this person here. Is this a saint, for example? I don't know. That's a really good question. I don't even have a BS answer for you, right? I don't even have a thinking on my feet guessing answer. My guess, okay, here's my thinking on my feet guessing answer. They're trying to fit them in there as much as they can. And you find a great range of sizes of figures here that have nothing to do with hierarchy, more to do with just composition, I think. On the opposite side, right, beneath the demons, we see that the people who are rising out of the graves aren't particularly happy about this all. And in fact, that guy in the middle has to be grabbed by these hands and yanked from the grave. And you can see the look on his face is absolutely terrified. And then here's our word, right? Terror, right? Horror, you can see over here as well, from that inscription. And obviously this is a horrifying thing. And what's interesting is that, of course, nobody's happy on this side, right? They're being raised from their graves at the end of time, and they know they're bad, right? And they know their fate is up above with these demons who can't wait to traumatize them for the rest of their lives, and weeping and wailing. But again, with this very angular, very sort of cartoony figural style that we saw going back to the doors of Bishop Bernward, or maybe that St. Matthew from the Ebbo Gospels, that's still that same expressive style. Immediately next to this figure who's being yanked out of the grave, look at the claws, right? See the fingernails there? Ooh, Freddy. right, from Nightmare on Elm Street or something, Wolverine. On either side of this, we have a figure here grabbing onto his money bag. So it's a scene of greed, right? One of the 7 deadly sins. And over here we have a woman who's naked but has snakes biting her breast and hanging around the rest of her body. And she's meant to be a personification of lust. Greed and lust. Maybe the rest of the 7 deadly sins are here as well. But I think when we look back at medieval literature, these are the 2 sins that the church was most focused on. We find this throughout medieval art, is that greed, of course, keeps you from giving money to the church, and lust is something that the monks really had to deal with, having given up all earthly things for God. So these are highlighted here as well. So again, the theme continues throughout both the tympanum and the lintel, the idea of raising from your grave to meet your eventual fate. And on Christ's right side are the good, on his left side is concentrated the bad. And this is the norm for every scene of the Last Judgment. Right in the center is Saint Michael, who by tradition separates the saved from the damned and helps Christ. So he's directly beneath the feet of Christ here. And you can see what's interesting is that his attention seems to be turned toward the damned rather than the saved. Just as the artists seem to have a lot more fun focusing on the damned than the saved. They're a lot more fun to look at it. And again, this is the idea of judgment, right? He's turning to the bad in judgment rather than turning to the good in welcoming. And that's part of the overall message of trying to scare you into doing the right thing, which is all about the assertion of the church's power at the time when they have as much power as they ever had. Interestingly, directly beneath the feet of Christ, it says Gislibertus hoc fecit, which in Latin says Gislibertus made this. It's an artist's signature. Now, who Gislibertus was, we don't know. We don't have a complete set of records from the church at Autun. But we're pretty sure he's the artist in charge of the group working here. Because there seems to be a fairly consistent style in all of the sculptures that appear at Autun. But it's a rare example of an artist's signature. And the idea that one artist ought to be in charge rather than carving everything is exactly what we saw going all the way back to ancient Greece, where you remember Phidias was in charge of the drapery style, right? Because he had many artists working for him, and there was an attempt to make the style consistent. Gislibertus is probably, and again I say probably, we don't have a smoking gun on this. It's a bad analogy these days, isn't it? A smoking gun. Anyway, we don't have a solid piece of evidence about this. But it seems to be the general consensus that Gislibertus was our sculptural supervisor for the church at Autun. Finally, around the archivolt on the outside, you see this series of round images encased with a small round frame. These are the labors of the months. These are activities associated with each of the seasons, and in particular with each of the months. And they can be traced back to Roman art. Who's doing the season sarcophagus? Right? There are images of activities beneath the feet of those figures that help us to identify which of the 4 seasons we're looking at there. All the way back to Roman times, there was this idea of associated particular activities with the time of year. And we have the same thing here. So, in this case, we have the second one down is a figure mashing grapes. This is Burgundy, after all, right? They're making wine. And 2 down from that, at the very bottom, we have a figure that's striking a tree to gather nuts, to knock the nuts out of the tree at the end of the season. In between those, we have other images. What's the one at the very top? You have a guess? The figure with the scales? Sorry? Zodiac signs, exactly. That's Libra. Right? So even though you might think immediately, oh, it's another part of the Last Judgment, it has nothing to do with that. It's the zodiac sign. So you have Libra and Scorpio, right? Intermittent with these activities. to show us that the grape mashing is what happens at October, November, right? End of October, early November. That's when you mash the grapes. That's when you harvest grapes. And at the end of November, early December, that's when the trees, as we know, right, are dropping all their nuts. And he's gathering them now for the winter, just as the squirrels are all doing out there now, right? So these are particular labors associated with each of the particular months, and they appear on the outside of this probably as a symbol that time is ending, right? This is the cycle of time from beginning to end. And they start down here with January, and they move their way all the way to the end with December here, including some intermittent bits for summer and fall and so forth. That adds up to the extra circles. I have one more detail here. From the very end, we have Sagittarius, then a man gathering sticks, then Capricorn, and a man slaughtering pigs down below. Each of these activities have been fairly codified, right? They're fairly, dare I say, set in stone by this time, right? Each one of them rather quickly identifiable. But again, here paired with the different zodiac signs in order to facilitate the reading of them. Right? One last thing to remember as we're looking at these images of labor from the Middle Ages is that this is the period of feudalism. And that one of the things that came out of, one of the things that came out of the investiture conflict was that the church also owned land, just like nobles did in the feudal system. And for that land, they were not answerable fully to the emperor. They had some independence. So we should think about the owners of this church as also being like nobles, medieval landowners. And what we're seeing here is representations of part of the feudal system. Some of the labors of the monks, for example, show nobles doing certain activities. Usually picking flowers and stuff, simple things, right? Warming their feet by a fire maybe, having a feast. But then we also see peasants working. This is the feudal system. Peasants work for the nobles. The nobles have an agreement with the landowners, right? The feudal lords. And the church functions very much like a feudal lordship. And the images here relate to this height of the feudal system. Began around the 9th century, continues all the way to the 14th, 15th century as the primary economic system of Europe. Right? So that relates to the images that we're seeing here around the outside of the Ark of Vault. Yeah. They did, yeah. Every abbey and every bishopric actually owned property, right? And I don't have my politics exactly right. I think that they actually got the property deeded to them through the empire, right? But their actual ability to appoint who's in charge of it was kept internally. Does that make sense? Right? And as such, just as any other baron or duke, right, or count, would also have a relationship through this pyramid structure, if you will, right? The church in certain regions also did, right? The local parish did. And so this abbey, Saint-Lazare is a monastery, or was, it's not anymore. Was a monastery. And they had a land inside the monastery, but they also had the surrounding territory as well, right? And so they governed that in the same way that a noble, a duke, would have peasants working for him, where the peasants were, given what they needed to survive, but the majority of the income comes back and feeds through the landowner, right? So, again, our labors of the monks, which are fairly common in Romanesque cathedrals, relate very much to this new power of the church as a landed entity. Right? So we've been in Burgundy. Autun is the little blue circle here. We're going to look at another church from Burgundy, which was, by the way, France wasn't France yet, right? France was really, the country of France was basically like right here. That was it, right? The rest of them were independent counties, if you will, or duchies. And so the Duchy of Burgundy was governed by the Duke of Burgundy, and Autun and Vézelay are both there. So we're by car it's about 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, right? That's if you want a sense of distance, yeah? And so here we're at the church of Vézelay, and Autun had the bones of Lazarus. Vézelay had the bones of Mary Magdalene, right? And became a very prominent site for anybody wanting to visit it. And you can see as we look now at the entryway, that it too has a Romanesque arch over the doorway and a highly decorated tympanum in the same style that we looked at with these elongated mirrorless figures. And we'll look at it in some detail here. But it's a stone's throw away from Autun. And both Lazarus and Mary Magdalene came to France together back in the 1st century. And this is why their relics were there. You can actually go see them. In the crypt, they have some of them on display. That little glass thing there has got one of Mary Magdalene's bones in it, so they say. And relics played a major role in the life of the faithful in the Middle Ages. So this is in the crypt at Vézelay. Relics played the same role that icons did in the Byzantine Empire. They were something that you would venerate, not pray to, right? You would venerate them without worshiping them. But they also played a role in bringing that saint to your presence, right? That a prayer said at a relic was believed in the Middle Ages to actually make the prayer more likely to be answered, right? Make the saint whose relic they are more likely to hear your prayer. Remember, we talked about this going back to St. Peter's, the church that was built by Constantine at the grave of St. Peter, another one over the grave of Christ in Jerusalem. Right? These were built because pilgrims were flocking there with the idea that by doing that and praying there, that prayers were somehow more efficient than if they just simply prayed at home. Relics had the same power. And what we find through the Middle Ages is there's quite a bit of trafficking in relics, buying and selling of relics, with the idea that a good relic, really rotten analogy, but I like it anyway. I just found it. It's not in my notes. It's like getting a football team, right? And aren't the Chargers moving to LA from San Diego? Supposedly, right? It's in the air. But why does LA care? Because they don't have one, right? But why do they want one? Right? Good money. People come. They spend money on these things, right? Kevin Costner, if you build it, they will come, right? If you got a good relic, people will come. You know, there's money in it. Possessing a relic. There's a tourist industry, for lack of a better word, in the Middle Ages built up around the idea of relics. Going to a particular place to see the bones of a particular saint. And the big ones, right, the heavy hitters, your Mary Magdalene's, your St. Lazarus's, right? The grave of Christ, the grave of St. Peter, these are huge draws. And we find quite a few people moving all over Europe just to see them. Just to have the first. Next year is the Jubilee year in Rome. Any Catholics out there? Kind of hard practicing Catholics? It's the Jubilee year in Rome. It means if you go to Rome next year, there's special dispensations from the Pope for pious activities that you might do in visiting Rome. Right? It's still a practice today. It's like, holy tourism, if you will, right? So the idea of being a pilgrim to relics. And so the church at Vézelay, housed the relics of Mary Magdalene, was rebuilt in the early 12th century after a fire, I believe. And it was rebuilt simply because there were quite a few pilgrims coming here. It was again a functioning monastery. They had a house to put people up who had come here to visit. Right? So in the crypt is Mary Magdalene. And over the tympanum, we have a layout that looks very, very similar to what we saw at Autun, where Christ is in the center again with that oval around the outside of him. Heaven is opening up again. And Christ appears to us one more time from heaven to us here on earth. That's the theme that Romanesque churches prefer. The miraculous vision of Christ in heaven, seen by people on earth. In this case, it's not a last judgment. In this case, it's from the very end of the Gospel of Matthew, where he talks about the fact that after Christ was crucified, after he died, after the resurrection, and he goes back to heaven, he comes back to the apostles one last time, at the very end of the book of Matthew. And he makes one final appearance to them before he goes off to heaven forever, or until he comes back at the end of time, right, for the last judgment. So this is the last appearance of Christ on earth after his death, so it's still miraculous, but before the last judgment, which is still in the future. What does Christ come back to tell the apostles to do? Who knows this? Why does he come back to the apostles one last time? Tell the people that God's coming. Georgie, do you have something? That's the key, right? Tell them to go out, go and spread the gospel, right? Go and tell everybody what you know about this. You know, this miracle that you've seen. Right? My resurrection. Go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations. That's what this illustrates. Christ has got his apostles surrounding him on either side, very badly damaged. French Revolution, they associated all of these churches with the royalty of France, the French kings, for no particular reason, right? But they did, and they were destroyed. There was also a series of religious wars in the 16th century. In any event, a lot of the heads are missing from our apostles. But Christ is in the center now, coming with the clouds opening around him. We can see here and here clouds coming out. His hands out to the side reminds us of the crucifixion. We see this oval around him. We don't have, well, we do, I guess, have little Romanesque seats beneath him still. And he's telling the apostles, go out therefore, preach to every nation, make disciples of all men. And you can see that with that gesture, he's got these massive, massive hands. Well, one, because the other one's broken. But just like we saw going back to Octonian art and Carolingian art, that expressive style that alters proportions in order to make the expression that much more strong. So he's pointing to the apostles, and I've got to detail this here, right? There he is close up, and we can see the jittery nature of his robes, the way they swirl around his body, just like Matthew's robes in the Evo Gospel. And from his massive fingertips come these beams down to the heads of the apostles as he's giving them this message. He's empowering them, right? And almost like something out of a comic book, where from his fingers shoot these sort of lightning bolts, these rays of light that go from his fingertips to the foreheads of the apostles as they are sent forth to convert all of the nations. Here's a close-up of the apostles, and again you can see this nervous linear style that we've seen for 300 years now. And there are apostles carrying their books as they're about to go out, and we can see now the lights from Christ's hand coming down to the different apostles as they're sent forth to make disciples of everyone. Right? Again, it has archivolts around the outside that show the labors of the month, just like at Otan. So in this case, what do we have here? A feast at the very bottom. The next one up, a figure carrying water, is Aquarius. A figure warming his feet by the fire, a pair of figures there, and then Pisces at the top. So different activities associated with the different months. Feasting with January, foot warming with February. And the zodiac signs here to indicate that. Right? This is a message for all time. One last thing and then we'll quit. I think, there we go. In the inner archivolt, right, the out part of the tympanum, the outside of the tympanum, where Christ's head extends, we see these compartments with figures in them. 8 of them. And as we look at them closely, we find out that these are the nations that he's sending their disciples to convert. And based on manuscript illustrations, there have been numerous identifications for the different figures. Again, comparing them to similar illustrations. So in this particular case, the second group up, based on their headwear and their costuming, are meant to be the Jews. Judaica, as the people that Christ is sending the apostles out to convert. These are the foreigners to Christianity, if you will. Go ye therefore make disciples of all nations. So costuming plays a role with this figure. At the very top, something much more interesting happens. At the very top, we have figures that are human but have animal heads. Dog-headed figures. And again, from medieval manuscripts, we know that figures with dog heads were believed to live in India. Go figure, right? But in the mountainous region of India, coming off of the Himalayas. And in this case, again, is meant to signify them as someone who needs conversion. These people are subordinate to the Europeans, and they need the message of Christ. This is part of that again. Go ye therefore make disciples of all nations. Why? Because they need it. Right? Their outward form shows that they are not as civilized as our Burgundians are. We'll finish up this. We'll look at Gothic art on Thursday. I'm probably going to have to update that slide list. I put up a slide list this afternoon and sent you an email about it. It's only got about 30 works on it and far fewer compare and contrast options. But I'll be updating that as I put together our final lecture for Friday. Okay? Good luck on the paper. Again, if you're going to run late, let me know. Okay. I can't read that quickly. Put the footnote mark after the punctuation. Yeah, that's great. That's great. You can move the figure one up here after DC. That's where you mentioned. There it is. Yeah, that's great. That's terrific. Yeah. All right. Whit.
Two things. So we started Friday morning. I can't just my other final time. So if the morning's not good for you, I know you have other stuff.
Send me an email reminder, okay? Because I got to look at my stuff at home. Make sure that the time is okay. The back of my mind says, here, let me turn this off. In my mind, I think it's great. It's going to be perfectly fine.